Yesterday in my video, I posted part 1 of a 3-part series talking about propaganda. In that video, I broke down the 10 most common techniques used in propaganda, and then we went over a couple of well-known historical examples. The examples I used yesterday are ones that technically or usually have a positive connotation with folks in the United States. We went over Rosie the Riveter and the Uncle Sam campaign. I told you I picked those positive propaganda campaigns because I wanted to prepare you for some of the content we were going to be talking about next. In this segment of the video, we're going to talk about psychological and emotional manipulation techniques that are often used in propaganda. I'll go over a few of those techniques, and then again, at the end, I will show you some historical examples. I want to forewarn you now, before we get to the second half of that video, that those examples that I'm going to share might upset you. So I have made the choice to pixelate or blur out certain portions of those posters because I think the images that they represent are extremely harmful to some of the members of my community. And I also want to make sure that no one who's watching my content for education walks away feeling traumatized or wounded. I want you to be able to learn about this information so you know when you see it out in social media and in the media as a whole, not to do you harm. So please understand that I made that choice to pixelate those images with a strong reverence for history and understanding that seeing those images is critical. It's how we continue to develop our empathy. It's how we continue to learn so that we don't repeat the history that we've lived through. But again, because those images are hurtful to folks, I want to make sure that I'm keeping everyone safe. So let's jump into the techniques. The first technique is repetition. This is very simple. This is repeating a message over and over and over again until folks hear it so much that they start to believe that it's the truth. The second technique is the appeal to authority. This is citing institutions or experts as unquestionable sources, regardless of their actual credibility. This is saying, I demand that you accept that this person is an expert and you can never critique, question, or judge the things that they say. The third is something we talked about a lot in the last video, which is the appeal to emotion. This is meant to trigger your emotions like anger, or pride, or shame, or joy, or hope, rather than appealing to your logic or your reason. The hope here is that if they can trigger enough of an emotional response, it'll override your logical thinking. The next technique is scapegoating. This is when you blame a person or a group for a broader problem. An example of this can be in the dialogue around immigrants or the dialogue around minorities as a whole in the United States. Anytime someone says, you only have this problem because of them, that's scapegoating. The next technique is gaslighting. You've heard a lot about gaslighting in a lot of different spaces, but specifically when talking about propaganda, gaslighting is meant to make people doubt their own experiences or even their sanity, and it's often used to undermine dissent or resistance. The next one is whataboutism, and this is when you deflect criticism by pointing to other issues or accusing others of hypocrisy. You are probably likely very, very familiar with whataboutism if you ever engage in back and forth conversations in the comments on any form of social media. Anytime you bring up a topic and someone says, what about blank, you are seeing this in action. So now I'm going to go over some of those real life examples, and I have one example of each. So again, let's be prepared to look at some of this propaganda, knowing that it's negative, knowing that its intent was to do harm and incite an emotional response. If that's what it does in you, on a negative or a positive side, then you are being impacted by the propaganda itself. So let's dive in. So my first example, which I'm not going to share a photo of because it's so recent that you've seen it everywhere, and this was the Stop the Steal. This was a U.S. election fraud claims that were made from 2020 to now, but from 2020 to 2021, you really saw constant repetition of this phrase, stop the steal. It was repeated endlessly by the, at the time, former president, allies across social media, in rallies, across conservative media, on social media, working overtime to create a false perception that the 2020 U.S. presidential election was stolen. Despite over 60 court cases disproving and rejecting these claims, repetition created a strong belief in this false narrative among millions that's still repeated today. So the second thing I want to talk about is an example for appeal to authority. Now this is the Sackler family. And in this example, I want to talk about Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family citing medical experts on OxyContin safety in the 1990s through the 2000s. Purdue Pharma promoted OxyContin as a safe and non-addictive drug using select doctors and paid experts to promote the claim despite the growing evidence of harm. The appeal to medical authority delayed public skepticism and fueled the opioid epidemic. They basically brought up any doctor or official who they could put money in the pocket of who was willing to say, regardless of all the strong evidence about the dangers of this drug, it was perfectly safe. My next example will be around appeal to emotion. And in this, we're going to talk a little bit about the post-9/11 imagery and rhetoric used to justify the Iraq War from 2001 to 2003. Now, I was in high school during this to age myself, and this was the first time that I really recognized how much of the propaganda I was seeing by the modern government was reflective of the kind of propaganda I was learning about in my Germany and Soviet Russia classes at the time. Now, the Bush administration used emotionally charged language like mushroom cloud to invoke feelings of the past and past wars. They invoked 9/11 imagery over and over and over again to a level of exploitation of those who were impacted by this tragedy. And they used that imagery and that language, talks of terrorism, to drum up fear and support for invading Iraq, even though Iraq had no justifiable link to 9/11 in that time. These emotional appeals overshadow the lack of clear evidence for weapons of mass destruction. Yet, many people still today believe that those weapons were out there somewhere. Now, this next example I'm going to talk about is an example where I have chosen to pixelate the image. This is a very famous piece of propaganda from Germany that blamed for economic and social decline in the 1930s and 1940s. This is something you are likely all very familiar with. The regime blamed Jewish folks for Germany's World War I loss, economic woes, and cultural problems, which built widespread and support for. Scapegoating specifically helped unify this population under a false cause, which then made them feel secure in justifying the horrifying actions that they were seeing unfold. The party worked so hard to create the perfect and intentional scapegoats out of anyone in German society that they didn't like, that folks turned the other way at the literal eradication of their neighbors. Now, the words on this poster translate to essentially the enemy behind the Allies, or the power behind the Allies. And it was basically a piece of German propaganda saying that the Allied powers during World War II were being controlled, puppeted, and funded by the Jewish population. And then here we have a nice example of gaslighting. So the tobacco industry from the 1950s about to the 1990s were running these campaigns where they were denying smoking risks despite, again, a ton of evidence, very similar to the OxyContin example. So what cigarette companies did was launched PR campaigns to cast doubt on the connection between smoking and cancer. Again, even though their own research coming from within their own companies showed explicitly the direct link between their products and cancer. Now, part of the way that they did this was through these PR campaigns where they made lots of advertisements and posters about doctors, dentists, nurses, clergy people, what their preferred cigarette of choice was, how safe it was in comparison to the others, and how you should just keep smoking it up. And then the last example is whataboutism. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had a campaign that responded to the U.S.'s criticism of human rights by launching a campaign about America's history with. I hope this helped.